The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Governor Cuomo has made it clear that he'd like to close the controversial Indian Point nuclear power plant that's just 50 miles north of New York City and the borough of the Bronx. But his ideas have been scoffed at by some energy experts who say that closing Indian Point would cripple the New York metro area with energy shortages, hurt the environment and the economy as well. Tonight's guests do not agree. You too can weigh in with what you think about Indian Point by calling 718-960-7241. You can also email comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Please join me in welcoming from the Westchester Citizens Awareness Network, Marilyn Ellie. Good evening.
Good evening.
Joining
Thank
us.
you for having
and
me.
A longtime environmental activist, professor of physics and chemistry at Pace University, and chair of the science department at Packer Collegiate Institute, Chris Williams. Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting
Marilyn,
me.
let's start with you. I mean, you could advocate the closing of Indian Point, and it would take a half hour to get everything you know, I'm sure, if not more. But in summary, why do you think Indian Point should be closed?
We don't need it. It's a menace. It's bad for people. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for the river. And we have a deregulated market on electricity. So replacing the power is not a problem. And the doomsayers that say it is, they're wrong. We can look at the contracts for the way energy is delivered and see that Con Ed's only using a very small 560 megawatts of the 2,000 that Indian Point produces. And Entergy itself, I mean, they keep doing all this propaganda. There's a real disconnect between what they say publicly and then what they come to meetings when they have to prove things. Entergy is on record as saying that should electricity rates go up at all, they would not go up more than 5%. And that would be about $65 for the average family per year, which, if you look at what that plant does and the potential harm, is pretty cheap insurance for 1 year.
We should be clear for people who aren't familiar with it. Entergy, it's not energy, it's Entergy is the company
That's
that
right.
owns and operates
Thank you.
Indian
Yes,
Point.
I forget that.
Mr. Williams, from your perspective, talk about this idea of replacing energy. I mean, some of the numbers, and we'll get into that because I know it's a point of contention on your part, but some of the numbers say that, 16 to 23%. I think the Daily News and the Times said 25% of the city's energy. Village Voice had a statement that said up to 30% of the city's energy is used by Indian Point. If you have to replace energy in this day and age with the complexities of our energy systems, how could it possibly be done?
I think it's actually quite easy. According to Con Ed's annual statement last year, 2010, they're only contracted to buy 350 megawatts from Entergy Indian Point.
That's per day, per year? How does that work?
Per year. So, sorry, per day. And so on a hot day, in the middle of the day, when everybody's using their air conditioners, New York City and Westchester is more like 12, 13 terawatts. So like an enormously much larger number than Entergy is supplying, because Entergy can sell wherever they want outside of what's contracted by Con Ed. So they will sell to whoever is the highest bidder. They don't have to sell to the city beyond what they're contracted for. So the amount of energy that we could substitute from other sources, either upstate or from New Jersey, is certainly possible. If you read the studies by the Wall Street Journal and various other places, nuclear energy comes out at around 12 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour, far more expensive actually than wind or other alternatives.
So this explains in part, and I looked through a lot of the literature that you folks work on, and it says that basically Indian Point only produces 4 to 6% of
depending on the season.
Depending on the season, and that also would back up what you say is that publicly they'll put out that it's 25 or 30%, but then you're saying the documents actually show that it's only 4 to 6%. I mean, is that accurate?
That is very accurate, and I can tell you where that 30% figure probably comes from. If you go to Con Ed's website, you will see that a pie chart where it breaks down their energy portfolio, where they get from different sources, how much. And on that pie chart, it says that 30% of their entire energy portfolio is nuclear. So people look at that and say, Indian Point, 30%. But it's not all Indian Point. The state and other states have a lot of other nuclear power plants. So Con Ed's not taking that 30% of their energy nuclear part of their portfolio from Indian Point. People don't stop to think of that.
I'll take a quote out of the Times. Closing the plant could also increase the frequency of power failures. Officials who run the state's high voltage grid say that given that New York has weak ties to generation capacity in other states, the claim is that New York State is behind the 8 ball compared to even New Jersey or some of the New England states when it comes to sharing power, and that the complexity of energy and managing energy in New York State kind of isolates it from the other states. Is that accurate?
No, it's not accurate. Those people need to read the Wall Street Journal and some other people and other places and other reports that are looking at marketing and how well we now move electricity around. We had a blackout in 2003. It was a cascading blackout that the ISO said could never happen. Well, it happened, not because of an energy shortage, but basically because of a lack of maintenance in Ohio. So we had this cascading blackout. After that, a lot of things were put in place to ensure, theoretically, that we would never have another cascading blackout. And that had a side effect. The side effect of that was that we now in this grid move things around much more efficiently. They may be talking about a grid prior to 03, 04, I don't know, but right now it's not perfect. We have jams, we have things that block our transmission, particularly to New York City, which is always a special case. But electricity here goes all around.
Chris,
up to Canada.
Let's talk a little bit about the idea of replacing energy that you said, it'd be easy to do. And we've done a number of shows on energy on this program over our 17 years. One of the main issues in New York State, and this you see it repeated when you talk about the potential of closing Indian Point, one of the main issues is not necessarily producing the energy, but moving the energy. That if the energy is produced somewhere else, and nobody wants more transmission lines, and they don't want transmission lines in their neighborhoods. How do you deal with the fact that if you create energy and then need to move it around, that you have that very difficult reality?
I mean, I agree that the distribution system here is somewhat antiquated and needs to be rethought. And I think you have to balance the fact that Indian Point every 2 years is one of the reactors is down for refueling for a couple of months, and there aren't any blackouts. So the city seems to manage to cope when Indian Point isn't operating at all and nobody notices. So it's actually not an essential part of our electricity production system. And what you're talking about is comparing the risks of a potential blackout, let's say, or not having enough electricity with the potential for a Fukushima on the Hudson, 30 miles from a major metropolis.
We certainly want to talk about that, and I am going to talk about that notion, but
I just wanted to compare the risks we're actually talking about here.
Listen, a blackout is not a good thing, and tonight, one of the hottest nights of the year, the thought of the potential for that, it would be horrifying, and it would be a terrible disaster. I mean, I'm not going to compare disasters, but again, this idea of transmission lines, would you put it in your neighborhood? Would you say, you know what, run those lines through my community?
Well, there were originally proposals that were objected to that were the transmission lines were going to go above ground. And then since new plans were introduced with the possibility of putting them underneath the ground, which is more expensive, but there was a plan in place to do that, then that seems like nobody would object to that if it means that we can have actually cheaper electricity, because there is abundant energy upstate and in other places. It is a question of transmitting it to where it's needed, which is obviously here, without resorting to having a nuclear power plant. We have 2 years to go until they're relicensing one of the reactors, and 2015 until they relicense the other. I mean, lots of people in New York City need jobs, right? Particularly construction workers. And so what we would be doing is actually providing a situation where we are insulating the city from future blackouts by construction of a logical planned out grid over the next 2 to 4 years.
It's ironic that you talk about jobs and then this idea that, well, maybe it'll cost a little more to run them underground. I'm just going to give you a quote from a Daily News op-ed piece. Says that Indian Point directly provides about 2,500 jobs, and they also wrote, closing the twin reactors means more illnesses and deaths thanks to increases in ozone and smog from additional fossil fuel combustion, as well as electricity supply problems, brownouts and blackouts that would affect services like transportation and life-sustaining air conditioning during heat waves, and your electric bills will soar. I'm assuming you don't agree with those items in that op-ed piece.
Boy, do I not. The underlying assumption from that is that there will be new generation, and that it will be all coal-based. We have plenty of electricity in our market. We are actually down from the official recommendations of official forecasts of how much electricity we're going to use. We're down because of the recession. And this is a real opportunity. Since we're not using as much electricity as expected, we don't need new generation right now in order to close down Indian Point. And we're not talking about new generation anyway. We have 300 power generators in New York State. And there is no reason in the world that we can't move that electricity. And we could certainly do it given a 2-year lead time to where it's needed. People are working on that now. There's a cable coming under the Hudson. That's supposed to be 560 megawatts. There is a line coming down from Canada that is 1,000 megawatts. It will come right into Yonkers. People all up and down New York State can use that. And it will end up in Yonkers and come on down to New York City. And I was at a meeting with the ISO, 2 representatives from the ISO, a meeting that Sandy Gale put together so that we could look at energy locally. And they said that they have providers standing in line to be vetted to provide electricity should Indian Point close. And they're in the process of vetting other people to get them on. So it's a market situation. I don't understand why people don't trust the market for this.
One of the notions that Governor Cuomo has put out, he said, well, you know what, we could do this, and if in fact we don't renew their licenses and their permits for water and all those things which are actually coming up, and the state does have a chance to have input in on it. If they do that, Governor Cuomo says by 2015, maybe even 2016, I can have enough supply running to replace Indian Point. Critics have said, Governor, you're out of your mind. That's never going to happen. Can we move, I guess, Mr. Williams, can we move that quick to get some of these infrastructures in place, given the technology that's involved and also the political will and everything else it would take to get it done?
I think that absolutely it can be done. Governor Cuomo has obviously carried out studies to show that. There are lots of studies that illustrate that it can certainly be done within the time frame that we have available. And there would be lots of other benefits to it. Like jobs is one obvious one.
Mm-hmm. So you say it'll create more jobs than you'd lose on the 2,500 jobs that if
it's not back up. It's not 2,500 jobs. There are 800 union workers there, and I have heard the union steward for Local 1-2 IBEW say our people will not be without a job. They may have to move. They may have to go to another nuclear power plant, but they're not going to be without jobs. And decommissioning needs workers.
I do want to go to the phone, but a real good question. I don't know which of you is better able to respond to it. What do you do with the nuclear materials if you do close down Indian Point?
Keep them right there.
Well,
you say keep them right there, then it forever becomes
That's right.
waste.
We used it. It's our mess.
You have a different response?
Well, no, not.
She jumped right in.
I have real strong feelings about that.
Not exactly, but I think, when we're talking about closing Indian Point, I think we have to be concerned about the jobs that exist there, which are very good jobs.
Absolutely.
And so, but decommissioning takes at least a decade. So we're talking 10 years into the future after we've closed it down, there will still be workers required who are already employed there to do that. So, and then there are highly skilled trained workers which we also need in many other locations. So.
I want to go to the telephone, and then I certainly do want to talk about the notion of what happened in Japan and the relationship between what might happen here, or what some say might happen here. Let's go say hello to our friend Mark from Pelham Parkway. Mark, how are you?
Hey, Gary.
What's up?
I'm amazed. I think I'm a boominated. I'm listening to
You're a what-inated?
Point, and I think Lisa Meitner and Albert Einstein are rolling over in their graves. We're almost 60 years down with nuclear energy, and the problem that you have with a nuclear plant, nuclear energy would be the best energy to use. It's probably what's going to drive us to the stars, not hydrogen, but nuclear. But the problem is that whatever you've had with nuclear energy is a bureaucracy. Con Edison should not be running a plant or have any energy to do with nuclear energy. What you need is nuclear physicists who know what the hell they're doing.
So,
with
Mark,
energy.
what is your advocacy here? You think that nuclear energy is just being mismanaged, and that's what the issue is?
Well, I'll give you the best example: Chernobyl and the Japanese plant. You saw it was mismanaged. They proved they were both mismanaged, and they cover things and they try and cut corners. E equals MC squared is the best power source you have when it's run right and you have intelligent people running it, not a conglomerate.
Got it.
And if you're going to need people to run it the right way...
So your point is, I got it. So your point is that Indian Point, if it were run properly, and the notion of nuclear energy is genius and could work very well, I'm guessing, given all that's gone on, the folks sitting at the table here are going to disagree that Indian Point is run well, right? You would certainly think it's not run well.
Well, first of all, Con Ed has nothing to do with running a nuclear power plant. They sold it a long time ago to Entergy. They sold it back in 2003. So your caller's absolutely right. They couldn't run it then. And Entergy runs nuclear power plants. They're the second largest, right after Exelon, producer. And I'll give them credit. They replaced a lot of stuff.
Let's talk about the viability of nuclear energy if it were run right, and with Chernobyl and
the NRC
Fukushima.
has no credibility. It's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I have been to enough meetings, and I've talked to enough people, and I've listened to them, and I've read their reports. They're not credible.
If Indian Point was run properly in your eyes, would you then say, okay, we like this, this is the way we should run our energy?
No. I would not say that, because nuclear power produces some of the most deadliest toxic waste in the history of this planet. It produces plutonium. There are 1,900 tons of highly radioactive material in each of the spent fuel pools at Indian Point.
What's the effect of Indian Point on the Hudson River?
It's terrible. The Hudson is a heritage river, and that's getting away from the spent fuel, and it's getting away from this whole issue of radioactive waste, which is not figured into the cost of your electricity, because the government, the taxpayers, our caller, pays for that. But the Indian Point needs to go to closed cycle cooling. They kill trillions of fish, first with the intake and then with the output.
But if they were to do that, would that reinforce what the caller says, that, well, you know what, then now it's... Let's let Mr. Williams
I don't want... I'm sorry,
weigh
Chris.
in on that. If they go to this closed cycle cooling, which is a different method, would you then say, well, you know what, then let's back off Indian Point?
Well, I mean, I think they would cut down on the billion fish that they kill a year, but we would still be...
A billion?
Yes.
Trillions. It's not on both ends of the,
But so it severely affects the viability of the river on many different levels. Furthermore, President Obama in 2007 called the NRC, which is supposed to regulate the agency, a moribund agency that was in the pockets of the corporations that it was meant to be regulating. This is the most expensive energy that we could possibly produce. There's not a single nuclear power plant being built anywhere in the world that is not backed by the state, because private investors will absolutely not touch nuclear energy. A Citibank report in 2009 said, nuclear power, once too cheap to meter, is now too costly to matter. Nobody will build. Nobody will build a nuclear power station because it is so expensive.
Despite the fact what the president has urged quite publicly and quite directly.
Well, since he's become president, he has now wanted, he's for expanding nuclear power.
That's what he claims, yes.
But he was also for expanding offshore drilling, and look what happened there with the BP spill last year. Mm-hmm. I don't think we want to see a nuclear accident anywhere. So.
I want to hold up this map that our friends brought, and I don't know if you can see it there. We can pan the camera a little bit off to the side. That basically it puts a bullseye right where Indian Point is, and then shows these circles, and down toward the bottom, 50 miles out, is where our home borough, the Bronx, is. I want to present a little counterpoint to that. We had a Fordham University earthquake expert in here in April. After the earthquake in Japan, he said the viability of Indian Point in the face of an earthquake would depend on the construction and the design of Indian Point, meaning that if Indian Point were found to be properly designed, then he wouldn't have a problem with it. He said Indian Point officials said it could withstand a magnitude 6 earthquake, and the nuclear damage that was caused in this situation in Japan was not caused by the earthquake, but by the tsunami that went afterwards. In any case, he recommended an independent study of the ability of Indian Point to withstand an earthquake. And he said, if we study it, then we can know. But he would certainly reject things like this and say this is fear-mongering. What are your thoughts?
Well, the head of the NRC, Commissioner Jaczko, asked Americans in Japan within a 50-mile radius to evacuate. And that has since proved to be a very wise decision because they have found this radioactivity and radioactive contamination spread well beyond the 50 miles all the way to Tokyo. And I would refer people to the Union of Concerned Scientists. The website is ucsusa.org. They just came out with a report talking about U.S. nuclear power after Fukushima. And what they're talking about is what the NRC itself needs to do. Some of those apply to Indian Point, some of them apply nationally. But we've never, for example, in this country had an accident scenario that had problems with more than one reactor. So if you have problems with one reactor, then you can draw on the resources of the other reactor. What if you have problems with both reactors? Where are your resources then? If you have a reactor, if you have an accident,
wouldn't that be the case if there was God forbid, a disaster in just about anywhere, that the redundancy of a system would be tested, regardless of what type of energy you were?
And don't we need to practice for those kinds of emergency evacuations? I mean, don't people know what needs to happen? Are these tabletop drills adequate? They're not.
That was going to be my follow-up. Are there sufficient evacuation plans? Now, you folks certainly are further north and closer to the plant than we are here in the Bronx, but 20, 30, 40, 50 miles out.
I'm 3 miles from the plant.
3 miles from the plant. If, God forbid, something were to happen, do you and your neighbors know what you might do, and are you find that you and your communities are sufficiently prepared?
No, we're not. I know exactly what I would do. I would go in and cut myself a nice piece of cheese, have some crackers, and a really good glass of wine. That's what I would do because there is no place to go. There is no place to run with this. And we can't do evacuation twice a day, and we call it rush hour. It's more like creeping and crawling hour. We can't do it twice a day.
Chris,
so how are we going to do an evacuation?
Is there any evacuation system, given the size of the plant and the density of the population around the plant, specifically, certainly as you get closer and closer to New York City, one of the largest cities in the world, is there any evacuation plan that could work, or any way that this could be dealt with if, God forbid, there was a Chernobyl or a 3 Mile Island or a Fukushima type accident at Indian Point?
No. I mean,
in a word,
no. I mean, we live on a series of islands. The Bronx is on the mainland, but as Marilyn was pointing out, gridlock is a pretty normal occurrence in New York. Imagine
on a good day.
Imagine what it would be like if the evacuation sirens were going.
You mean to tell me the Major Deegan is backed up a little too often for your liking?
I mean, everybody in New York knows what it's like to try and get back and forth.
And
via
frankly,
cars.
we know
And
what it
so-
was like after 9/11, the traffic
Exactly,
time.
exactly.
So there are no, really, as Marilyn so eloquently put it, she would just sit back and relax because there was no place to go.
There's no place to go.
We're almost near the end here. Let's take a step back and tell me how the process would work to decommission Indian Point and then reestablish sufficient energy systems that would provide the redundancy we need, as well as replace what we might lose from Indian Point.
Well, I think what we would need is a plan that Governor Cuomo can put into effect for when we're closing the plant, and then go on to decommission the plant. At the same time as starting from, very soon, basically, we start the connection process to a new transmission grid, which includes bringing in energy from Canada, as Marilyn was outlining earlier, or further upstate. There's plenty of energy sources around that we
Yes,
do
there
not
is.
have to rely on natural gas from fracking or
That's
coal
right.
plants or any of these. All of the alternatives that are compared, we can have clean energy in New York City, and not pay
I'm
more
going
for
to
it.
just throw in, and we're going to give Marilyn the last word, but I'm going to throw in that I think we would need some transparency and credibility in what information we're getting, because the information that you folks are talking about is widely different than the information that's being put out
Yes,
into
it
the
is.
media. Marilyn, you folks had some of the people upstate had a little session over the weekend, kind of a planning session. Tell me about, or tell our viewers what that was about, and we'll use that as a way of closing our program tonight.
Well, there were 55 people that gathered at Stony Point Conference Center. Chris was there, and a lot of other people who have networks and people that are not particularly anti-nuclear, but people who are very concerned and were working to make our communities cleaner and safer. And we came up with a vision statement. We will be going back and looking at concrete actions to take. And it's remarkable that 55 people turned out on a beautiful summer afternoon and spent 6 hours talking about Indian Point.
Do you believe that Governor Cuomo is the one, and he's going to make this happen? Real quick, because
Yes,
we're out of time.
and I want to
Yes.
say, low probability, high impact, 20 million lives. How much is electricity worth? 20
Jane,
million
if
lives?
you could put up some of their contact info for people who want more information. That stuff's been running all show. Chris Williams, thank you so much. Marilyn, Ellie,
you very much.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
And folks, if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of Bronx Talk are available at bronxnet.org. You click Bronx Talk on the right-hand navigation bar. Next Monday night, we welcome noted Bronx defense attorney Murray Richmond back to our show. Don't worry, Murray, excuse me, that's his name. Don't worry, Murray. We'll talk about some of the nation's most controversial cases, like the Casey Anthony trial and the prospective trial of the accused killer of that Brooklyn boy, which was such a tragic story for everybody. It should be interesting next week, and of course, every Monday night. We'll see you then, and every Monday night at 9 for Bronx Talk. Special thanks to producer Jane Folloro, director Michael Arias, Dina, our cast of thousands up in the booth, my good friend Margot, who helped bring the guests here tonight, and to you, good night.
Along with weight loss, it's one of the many ways to fight osteoarthritis pain. For more information on managing pain, go to fightarthritispain.org.
E3. Nice, Dad. Nice, Dad. Nice.
Charles,
Nice, Dad.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of siblings in foster care who'll take you just as you are.